and you tried to sell it back to me. My words hung in the air of Borrington's calf, each syllable a quiet thunderclap against the backdrop of clinking silverware and hushed conversations. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across our corner table, illuminating dust particles that danced between us like unsettled ghosts. Diana, I couldn't bring myself to call her mother in that moment, sat perfectly postured in her cream cashmere sweater, not a silver hair out of place. Her face, usually a masterpiece of composure, fractured slightly at the edges. A muscle twitched near her eye. The pearls at her neck seemed to constrict. Ellen, you're being ridiculous, she hissed, voice low but sharp enough to cut. This isn't about betrayal. It's about practicality. You've always been too emotional to see the bigger picture. Across from her, Catherine Reynolds, my attorney, laid out the documents one by one, the forged signature on the sale agreement, the plane tickets proving I was across the country when I supposedly signed, the authentication certificates for the art pieces they'd tried to replace with reproductions. Each paper landed with the weight of truth. Mrs. Caldwell, Catherine said, her professional calm a perfect counterpoint to my mother's framed composure. Forging your daughter's signature is a felony. The evidence is irrefutable. James Wilson, the property developer, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. My cousin Pamela, tucked into the corner seat, stopped scrolling through her phone. Even my father Robert, perpetually passive, couldn't meet my eyes. I studied them all, these people who shared my blood but not my values. For 45 years, I'd been the quiet one, the librarian who spoke softly and stepped aside. The one they thought they could simply write out of the story. But Grandpa Henry had known better. A silent river still carves mountains, he used to tell me, his weathered hand patting mine. Never mistake stillness for weakness. As I watched my mother's carefully constructed fod crumble, I felt no triumph, only a deep, complicated ache. This wasn't how family was supposed to end. Catherine slid one final document across the table, Henry's original will, with its explicit clause about the house. My inheritance. My legacy. We're done here, she said, gathering her papers as my mother stared at the evidence of her betrayal. In that moment, caught between victory and heartbreak, I understood what Grandpa meant about being the keeper of meaning. Some things, memory, truth, integrity, were worth fighting for, even when the battle left scars on both sides. Outside, Boston's autumn painted the trees in fiery declarations of change. Nothing would ever be the same again. And perhaps that was exactly as it should be. 2 weeks earlier, the brass nameplate gleamed in the afternoon sun, mocking me with its unfamiliar lettering, P. Mitchell. I stood frozen on the brick pathway, my breath creating small clouds in the crisp autumn air. This couldn't be right. The plaque should have read Mitchell, my grandfather's name, not my cousin's. I clutched my shoulder bag tighter, a knot forming in my throat. 2 weeks since we buried Grandpa Henry, and already they were erasing him. Erasing me. My key still worked in the lock, small mercies, though the familiar creak of the door now sounded like a warning. The interior of the colonial home that had been my sanctuary since childhood felt wrong, too sterile, too perfect. Gone was the comforting clutter of Grandpa's books, the slight disarray that spoke of a life well lived. In its place, a museum-like precision that made my skin crawl. Ellen, you're early. My mother's voice, carrying from the hallway, was pitched in that artificial brightness she reserved for uncomfortable situations. Diana Caldwell appeared a moment later, elegant as always in tailored slacks and a silk blouse, silver hair swept into a perfect French twist. At 68, she still moved with the authority of the high school English teacher she'd been for 30 years, someone accustomed to controlling her environment. Early for what? I asked, though something in my stomach already knew. Pamela's been helping organize things, she said, gesturing vaguely toward the living room where neatly labeled boxes were stacked against the wall. We're preparing for the transition. I stepped further into the house. My childhood home during summer breaks, the place where I'd spent every holiday and long weekend during my adult life. The place Grandpa promised would be mine. Transition to what? Mother's smile tightened. The sale? Darling. The house goes on the market next week. The room tilted slightly. Sale? But Grandpa said, "Your grandfather said a lot of things, Ellen." She sighed, that familiar sound of disappointment I'd heard throughout my life. But wishes aren't legally binding. The property is in the family trust, and your father and I are the executors. I moved past her, needing to escape her perfectly reasonable tone, and found myself in Grandpa's study. The room was darker than I remembered, the heavy velvet curtains drawn against the afternoon light. His massive oak desk still dominated the space, but the surfaces had been cleared of his organized chaos, the stacks of research notes, the magnifying glass he used for examining manuscripts, the half-finished mugs of tea. Instead, everything was categorized into bankers' boxes, Henry's papers, family documents, books for appraisal. I ran my fingers along the edge of his desk, remembering how he'd sit here in the evenings, reading glasses perched on the end of his nose, sharing passages from whatever historical text had captured his imagination that day. "This house has good bones," he'd often say, "and so do you, Ellie girl. Remember that when the storms come." I hadn't understood what he meant until now. Standing in his emptied study, I felt my spine straighten slightly. Something wasn't right. Grandpa had been meticulous about his affairs, especially about the house. He wouldn't have left this to chance. A soft noise from the doorway made me turn. My father Robert stood there, looking older than his 70 years, hands tucked into the pockets of his cardigan. "Ellen," he said quietly, "we were hoping you'd be reasonable about this." I studied him, the stooped shoulders, the careful avoidance of direct eye contact. My father had spent a lifetime taking the path of least resistance, bending to my mother's stronger will rather than risking conflict. "Dad," Grandpa told me specifically that he was leaving me this house. He showed me the will. He shifted uncomfortably. "Things change, sweetheart. The house is too much for you to manage on a librarian's salary. The property taxes alone. I can manage just fine," I said, surprising myself with the firmness in my voice. "I want to see the will." His eyes darted toward the doorway, checking for my mother. "Your mother has all the paperwork." "But Ellen, please don't make this difficult. The buyer is offering well above market value." "Buyer? You already have a buyer?" The study door opened wider as Pamela sauntered in, phone in hand as always. At 43, my cousin had the polished look of the successful real estate agent she presented herself as: designer clothes, perfect manicure, carefully highlighted hair. She'd been my mother's favorite niece since childhood, the daughter Diana wished she'd had instead of quiet, bookish me. "James Wilson," Pamela said, not looking up from her phone. "Barrington Development. They're planning to renovate and flip. It's a great deal, Ellen. Everyone wins. Except me. Except Grandpa's legacy." "I need some air," I murmured, pushing past them both and heading toward the kitchen and the back door beyond. The autumn garden, at least, remained unchanged, Grandpa's prized hydrangeas fading into their fall colors, the old maple tree beginning to turn, the wrought iron bench where we'd spent countless evenings discussing books and history and the meaning of things. I sat heavily on the bench, trying to process what was happening. They couldn't just sell the house, not if Grandpa had left it to me. There had to be something I was missing. I closed my eyes, forcing myself to think like the research librarian I was. Facts, not emotions. Evidence, not assumptions. What would Grandpa have done if he'd suspected something like this might happen? Left a trail, of course. He was a historian, after all. And he taught me that history leaves marks, if you know where to look. The discovery. Ellen Caldwell? Walter Freeman's voice cracked slightly at the edges, his thin frame silhouetted against the morning light streaming through his kitchen window. At 78, Grandpa's oldest friend looked frailer than I remembered, but his eyes remained sharp, assessing me from behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Mr. Freeman." I stood awkwardly on his front porch, the envelope Grandpa had left me clutched in my hand. "I'm sorry to bother you, but Henry said you'd come." He stepped aside, gesturing me in with a gnarled hand. "Took you long enough." The small bungalow smelled of coffee and old books, a comforting combination that immediately reminded me of Grandpa. I followed Walter through the narrow hallway into a sunny kitchen where 2 mugs already waited on the table. "You knew I was coming today?" I asked, settling into a chair as he poured coffee with careful precision. Walter's smile was small but warm. Not today specifically, but Henry knew what they tried to do. Diana never could see past dollar signs, even as a child. I wrapped my hands around the mug, drawing warmth from the ceramic. Then you know about the house? And the art collection and the first editions. He nodded, easing himself into the chair opposite mine. Your mother's been planning this since before Henry took ill. She and Robert need the money, his pension's not covering their lifestyle, and her retirement fund took a hit in the downturn. The revelation shouldn't have surprised me, yet it did. My parents had always projected comfortable security, the picture of upper middle class stability. How do you know all this? Walter reached for a folder tucked beside a stack of newspapers. Because Henry knew, and he prepared. He slid the folder across the table. Inside was a collection of documents, property deeds, insurance valuations for art pieces, verification of provenance for several first edition books, and, most shockingly, printouts of emails between my mother and cousin discussing how to handle Ellen once the property was sold. She said I was too emotional to manage the inheritance, I murmured, reading through the correspondence. That I just wasted on those dusty books you're always restoring. Walter made a sound somewhere between a snort and a sigh. Diana never understood what Henry was building, a legacy of knowledge, not just assets. But you did. I looked up from the papers, a memory surfacing of Grandpa showing me a fragile manuscript he'd acquired, explaining how such objects weren't just valuable for their rarity, but for the human connection they represented across centuries. There's something else, Walter said, reaching into a drawer and pulling out a small digital recorder. Henry left this with me. Said you'd need to hear his voice when the time came. He pressed play, and suddenly Grandpa was there in the room with us, his voice slightly raspy but unmistakable. Ellie, if you're listening to this, then they've done exactly what I feared. The house is yours, legally, morally, every way that matters. The clause in my will is explicit. They can't sell without your signature, witnessed in person by two separate parties. Diana knows this, but she's hoping you won't check. I felt tears threatening at the corners of my eyes. You've always been the quiet one, letting others speak over you. They mistake your silence for weakness, your thoughtfulness for indecision. But I've always seen the steel beneath. You're the keeper of meaning now, Ellie. Some things are worth fighting for. The recording ended, and I sat in stunned silence, processing his words. Keeper of meaning. It was what he called himself, a custodian not just of objects, but of their stories, their significance, their place in the human continuum. There's a lawyer you should talk to, Walter said, sliding a business card across the table. Catherine Reynolds. Henry arranged everything with her last year. I took the card, running my thumb over the embossed lettering. Why didn't he tell me any of this while he was alive? Walter's eyes crinkled with something like compassion. Would you have believed how far they'd go? Sometimes we can't hear certain truths until we're ready for them. Later, walking back to my car with the folder of evidence, I felt something shift inside me, a quiet recalibration, like tumblers falling into place in a lock. All my life, I'd been the one who stepped aside, who kept the peace, who absorbed others' disappointments rather than creating waves. Grandpa had seen something different in me. And maybe, just maybe, he'd been right. The research. My apartment felt smaller than usual that evening, the walls of my modest one-bedroom pressing in as I spread the documents across my dining table. 12 years as a research librarian had taught me methodical investigation, and I applied those skills now to the mystery of my own inheritance. First, the will. I read it carefully, highlighting the crucial clause. The Mitchell family home at 47 Hawthorne Lane, with all its contents, is bequeathed to my granddaughter, Ellen Caldwell. Under no circumstances may the property be sold without her explicit written consent, given in person before two witnesses. Clear, unambiguous, legally binding. Next, the sale agreement my mother had shown me, complete with what appeared to be my signature. I compared it to several samples of my actual handwriting, close, remarkably close, but not perfect. The slight curl at the end of the N in Ellen was wrong, too deliberate. I pulled my laptop closer, checking my calendar and email for the date of the supposed signing, May 14th. I'd been in Chicago that entire week, leading a workshop on manuscript preservation at the National Librarians Conference. I had flight confirmations, hotel receipts, even photos of me at the event. Forgery. Actual, criminal forgery. My hands trembled slightly as I organized everything into a folder. This wasn't just about deception anymore. It was fraud. My own mother had committed fraud. I reached for my phone, then hesitated. Who would I even call? My small circle of friends wouldn't understand the magnitude of this, the visceral betrayal beneath the legal technicalities. Instead, I opened my laptop and began typing a detailed timeline of events, organizing digital copies of all evidence, creating a case file as meticulously as I would for any research project. The work calmed me, the familiar process of documentation providing structure to the chaos of emotions. As midnight approached, I sat back in my chair, stretching tired shoulders. One question kept circling in my mind. Why? Why this desperate grab for money? Why the elaborate deception? My parents had always appeared comfortable financially. Dad's accounting career and mom's teaching pension should have provided a stable retirement. But appearances could be deceiving. I knew that better than most. I opened a browser and typed in their address, checking property records. Their home had a second mortgage taken out 3 years ago. I searched further, finding public records of a tax lien from 2 years back. More digging revealed a lawsuit against my father's former firm for mismanagement of funds, settled out of court, but the legal fees would have been substantial. They were underwater financially. And Pamela, despite her designer clothes and carefully curated social media presence showcasing luxury listings, had declared bankruptcy after her second divorce last year. They weren't just being greedy, they were desperate. The revelation should have softened my anger, but instead, it crystallized something harder within me. They could have asked for help. They could have been honest. Instead, they'd chosen deception, manipulation, theft. I picked up Walter's business card again and ran my finger over the name. Catherine Reynolds, Estate Law. Tomorrow, I decided. Tomorrow, I would fight back. Sleep came fitfully that night, memories washing over me in restless waves. Grandpa teaching me chess in his study. Mom's perpetual disappointment in my career choice. A librarian, Ellen? With your intelligence, you could have been a lawyer or doctor. Pamela and her friends laughing at my sensible clothes during family gatherings. Dad's gentle but ineffectual defenses of my choices. And beneath it all, Grandpa's voice, the keeper of meaning. What exactly had he meant? It wasn't until the gray light of pre-dawn that understanding finally came. It wasn't just about preserving objects, the house, the art, the books. It was about honoring what those things represented: integrity, knowledge, the quiet dignity of things that endure. My family wanted to convert Grandpa's legacy into cash. But some things, once sold, could never be bought back. The strategy. Catherine Reynolds' office occupied the top floor of a restored Victorian in Boston's Back Bay, the interior a blend of historical architecture and modern efficiency. The woman herself matched her surroundings, traditional pearl earrings and a tailored charcoal suit juxtaposed with a no-nonsense efficiency I found immediately reassuring. Henry Mitchell was one of my favorite clients, she said, after reviewing the documents I'd brought. Brilliant mind, excellent foresight. He anticipated exactly what's happening now. You knew my grandfather well? I asked, surprised by this connection. For nearly 20 years. I handled all his acquisitions, insurance valuations, property matters. She looked up from the papers, studying me. He spoke of you often, Miss Caldwell. With great pride, something warm and painful expanded in my chest. Grandpa and I had been close, but he'd never been effusive with praise. To hear he'd spoken proudly of me to others felt like a posthumous gift. Can they really sell the house without my consent? I asked, focusing on the legal matters at hand. Catherine's smile was small but sharp. Not legally, no. The clause in the will is ironclad. And forging your signature? That's criminal fraud. She leaned forward. But you should be prepared. They won't back down easily. People rarely do when caught in deception. What should I expect? Deflection, first, then counter accusations. Your mother will likely claim you're emotionally unstable, that Henry was mentally compromised when he wrote the will. She'll paint herself as the reasonable one, acting in everyone's best interests, including yours. The assessment was so accurate it made me flinch. All my life, mother had framed my quietness, my thoughtfulness, as weakness, evidence that I needed her guidance and control. What about the art? The books? I asked. Catherine nodded, making notes. We'll need to inventory everything immediately. Based on these insurance documents, some pieces have significant historical and monetary value. If they're planning to sell the house, they may have already moved or replaced items. The thought sent a chill through me. How do we proceed? Carefully. Catherine set down her pen. We need to document everything, file emergency injunctions to halt the sale, and prepare for their countermoves. But first, she reached for her phone, punching in a number. James? Catherine Reynolds. We need to talk about the Mitchell property on Hawthorne Lane. A pause. Yes, that's the one. No, I'm afraid there's a significant problem with the sale. I'm representing the legal heir, Ellen Caldwell. After hanging up, she turned back to me. James Wilson is an old colleague. Ethical, generally speaking. He wasn't aware of the irregularities with this transaction. What happens next? We meet. All parties, neutral location. I suggest Barrington's Cafe tomorrow at 2. Public enough to discourage scenes, private enough for frank discussion. She gathered the documents into a folder. In the meantime, don't confront your family directly. Don't tell them what you know. Let them think you're still the passive Ellen they expect. I nodded, drawing a deep breath. I can do that. Catherine's expression softened slightly. Your grandfather told me once that you had the quietest strength of anyone he knew. I believe we're about to prove him right. Outside, I stood for a moment on the brick sidewalk, watching autumn leaves skitter across the pavement. All my life, I'd avoided confrontation, stepping back, staying silent. The thought of facing my family across a table, challenging their deception openly, made my stomach clench with anxiety. But beneath the fear was something else, a slow-burning resolve. I thought of Grandpa's study, the careful way he preserved not just objects but their stories, their context, their meaning. I thought of his voice on the recording, the faith he'd placed in me. Some things were worth fighting for, even if the fight left you scarred. The memories. That night, sleepless in my apartment, I found myself pulling out old photo albums, physical ones, not digital, because Grandpa had insisted some memories deserved the permanence of paper and ink. Each page captured moments I'd almost forgotten. Summers at the lake house, Grandpa teaching me to fish. Holidays around the massive oak dining table, the room warm with laughter and debate. Quiet evenings in his study, learning to repair book bindings under his patient instruction. One photo made me pause, me at about 12, sitting cross-legged on the library floor surrounded by open books, completely absorbed. Mother stood in the doorway, her expression a complex mixture of exasperation and something else, perhaps fear? I couldn't recall the specific moment, but the dynamic captured was familiar enough. My passion for books and history had always mystified her, perhaps even threatened her. You're just like him, she'd say sometimes, and never as a compliment. The realization hit me with surprising force. She'd been jealous of my relationship with Grandpa, of our shared interests, of the comfortable silence we could inhabit together while she always needed noise and movement and attention. I turned another page, finding a photo from my graduate school graduation. Grandpa stood beside me, his arm around my shoulders, face creased with pride. Mother and father flanked us, smiling for the camera but somehow separate, as if posing for a different photograph altogether. There had been an argument that day, I'd forgotten until now. Mother had questioned my decision to specialize in historical preservation instead of rare book valuation. There's no money in preservation, she'd said over lunch. If you're going to waste your time with old books, at least learn how to profit from them. Grandpa had intervened, his voice mild but firm. The value of knowledge isn't always measured in dollars, Diana. Ellen understands that. She'd given him that look, the one that made her high school students quail. But Grandpa had simply continued eating his soup, unmoved. I closed the album, new understandings settling like sediment after a storm. This wasn't just about money, though that was certainly part of it. This was about control, about narrative, about who got to determine what mattered and what didn't. Mother had always tried to shape me into someone more like herself, practical, socially adept, materially focused. And for most of my life, I'd tried to bend to her expectations, quieting my own instincts, doubting my own values. But Grandpa had seen me clearly and valued what he saw. His legacy wasn't just the house or the collections, it was permission to be fully myself, to trust my own understanding of what gave life meaning. Tomorrow, facing my family across that caf table, I wouldn't just be fighting for property. I'd be claiming my own story. The revelation. The study door creaked softly as I eased it open, early morning light filtering through gaps in the velvet curtains. I'd returned to Grandpa's house one last time before the calf confrontation, drawn by an inexplicable certainty that there was more to discover. The room smelled of old books and furniture polish, the familiar scent momentarily transporting me back to countless afternoons spent here, listening to Grandpa's stories about historical figures who changed the world through quiet persistence rather than dramatic gestures. Revolution isn't always loud, Ellie, he'd say, eyes twinkling behind his reading glasses. Sometimes it's just one person refusing to accept what isn't right. I moved toward his massive oak desk, running my fingers along the worn edge where generations of Mitchells had sat to write letters, review documents, record family histories. The surface had been cleared of Grandpa's usual organized chaos, but the desk itself remained too heavy, perhaps, for Mother and Pamela to move without help. Kneeling, I examined the ornate panel work along the front of the desk. Grandpa had shown me once, years ago, how the third panel from the left concealed a small compartment, a family secret, he'd whispered conspiratorially. Every Mitchell desk since 1879 has had this feature. I pressed gently at the upper right corner of the panel. Nothing happened. Had they found it already? Discovered whatever Grandpa might have left? Then I remembered. It wasn't the third panel on this desk. This was his second desk. The original had been damaged in a basement flood 15 years ago. This one had the compartment in the fourth panel, not the third. I shifted position, found the right panel, and pressed. A soft click, and a slim drawer slid out, revealing a small leather journal and an envelope with my name written in Grandpa's distinctive slanted script. My hands trembled slightly as I opened the envelope first. Inside was a single sheet of cream-colored stationery. My dearest Ellen, if you're reading this, then you've remembered our lessons well. Trust your memory and your instincts. They rarely lead you astray. The journal contains something Diana desperately wants to hide, the real reason behind her urgent need for money. It's not my place to judge her choices, but neither will I allow her to destroy what we've built together. The truth may hurt, but secrets hurt more in the long run. Remember, Ellie girl, speaking up doesn't mean shouting. Sometimes the quietest voice carries furthest, if its words are true. All my love, Grandpa. I opened the journal with careful fingers, finding it filled with Grandpa's neat handwriting, dates, amounts, names. It was a record of loans made to my mother over the past decade, hundreds of thousands of dollars, none repaid. Notations indicated the purposes: D. Pamela's debt consolidation, D. Robert's legal settlement, D. investment recovery Madoff scheme. The final entry, dated just 3 weeks before his death, contained a single line: Diana requests $200,000 for final expenses. Denied. Suggested alternative solutions. Conversation unproductive. I sat back on my heels, pieces falling into place. My parents hadn't just been struggling financially, they'd been systematically draining Grandpa's resources for years. When he finally refused, they'd planned to sell his home and collections as soon as he was gone. Everything, the forgery, the rush sale, the dismissal of my inheritance, was born of financial desperation and entitlement. The journal also explained Mother's urgency. The documentation of these loans could potentially impact her share of any remaining inheritance, especially if Grandpa had formally recorded them as loans rather than gifts. I slipped the journal and letter into my bag, replaced the panel, and stood. Sunlight now streamed through the windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like suspended thoughts. In a few hours, I would face my family with this new knowledge, not to shame them, but to finally bring truth into the light. As I left the study, I paused at the threshold, looking back at the room that had been the heart of Grandpa's world and in many ways, mine. Whatever happened next, this moment of clarity was its own kind of inheritance. The confrontation. Barrington's cafe hummed with mid-afternoon activity, the clinking of cups and murmured conversations creating a civilized backdrop for what promised to be anything but a civilized discussion. I arrived 20 minutes early, selecting a corner table that offered some privacy while remaining visible to other patrons. Catherine joined me shortly after, her professional calm a steadying presence. "Are you ready for this?" she asked, arranging her documents with practiced efficiency. I thought of the journal in my bag, the years of deception it documented. "Yes, I think I finally am." James Wilson arrived next, looking uncomfortable in his expensive suit, followed minutes later by my parents and Pamela. Mother's eyes widened slightly at the sight of Catherine, though she recovered quickly, social training taking over as she extended her hand in greeting. "Diana Caldwell. I don't believe we've met." Catherine Reynolds, representing Ellen in this matter. Catherine's tone was polite but cool. "Thank you all for coming." We settled around the table, an awkward family reunion with legal implications. Father looked pained, shoulders hunched inside his cardigan. Pamela kept her eyes on her phone, thumbs scrolling in practiced indifference. Mother sat perfectly straight, a queen preparing to be reasonable with difficult subjects. "Ellen," she began, voice modulated to concerned parent pitch, "I wish you discussed your concerns with us directly before involving attorneys. Family matters should stay within the family." I met her gaze, noticing for the first time the slight strain around her eyes, the carefully concealed fatigue. "That's exactly why we're here, Mother. Family matters." Catherine opened her portfolio. "Let's be direct. The sale agreement for the Mitchell property contains a forged signature purporting to be Ellen's. We have documentation proving she was in Chicago on the date in question." James Wilson shifted uncomfortably. "I was assured all parties had consented to the sale." "They haven't," Catherine continued, sliding copies of Grandpa's will across the table. "Furthermore, this clause explicitly prohibits sale of the property without Ms. Caldwell's in-person consent before witnesses." Mother's composure cracked slightly. "That clause was added when Henry was already ill. It doesn't reflect his true intentions. The will was properly executed and witnessed 6 months before his diagnosis." Catherine counted smoothly. "The medical records confirm he was fully competent." Pamela finally looked up from her phone. "This is ridiculous. Uncle Henry wanted the house sold. He told me so himself last Christmas." I turned to her, keeping my voice level. "Did he? Or did he comment on how lovely it would be when your children visited for holidays in the future, and you interpreted that as you wanted to?" Her cheeks flushed. "Bullseye." Regardless of conversations, Catherine interjected, "The legal documentation is clear. The house belongs to Ellen. The attempted sale is invalid, and the forgery raises serious legal concerns." Father cleared his throat. "Surely we can resolve this without making accusations." "Ellen, sweetheart, we were only thinking of your best interests. The property taxes alone are manageable within my budget," I finished for him. "I've done the calculations, Dad." Mother's eyes narrowed. "You've always been impractical about money, Ellen. Just like Henry. All those dusty books and artifacts. But what about actual financial security?" I reached into my bag and placed Grandpa's journal on the table, opening it to the last page. "Speaking of financial security, I think we should discuss these loans." The color drained from Mother's face. She knew exactly what the journal contained. "Over $800,000 over 10 years, I said quietly. "For Pamela's debts after her divorces, for Dad's legal settlement, for your investment losses. Loans, not gifts. None repaid." A heavy silence fell over the table. Pamela stared at the journal, then at my mother, betrayal flashing across her features. She hadn't known the full extent of it then. Mother's hand trembled slightly as she reached for her water glass. "That's private family business. It has nothing to do with the house. It has everything to do with the house. I counted, my voice steady despite the hammering of my heart. When Grandpa finally refused to give you more money, you decided to sell his home and collections as soon as he was gone. James Wilson looked increasingly uncomfortable. Mrs. Caldwell, if there are competing claims to the property, there are no competing claims, Catherine interrupted smoothly. The will is clear. The house belongs to Ellen Caldwell. Mother's composure cracked further, her carefully maintained facade splitting like thin ice under too much weight. You have no idea what it's been like, she hissed, leaning forward. Robert's pension barely covers our property taxes. The Madoff scheme took half our retirement. We needed that money. Then you should have asked, I said, the words simpler than I'd expected. You should have been honest. Instead, you forged my signature and tried to steal my inheritance. Steal? Mother's voice rose sharply. I gave you life. Everything you are is because of me. And you tried to sell it back to me, I replied quietly. The words hung in the air between us, potent and immutable. Around us, the calf continued its gentle hum of activity, oblivious to our private implosion. Father looked stricken, aged beyond his years. Pamela's carefully maintained indifference had shattered, replaced by the naked calculation of someone reassessing their position. And Mother. For perhaps the first time in my life, I saw her clearly, not as the intimidating force that had shaped my existence, but as a woman terrified of losing her carefully constructed world. Ms. Caldwell, James Wilson said, addressing Mother with newfound formality. I'm withdrawing my offer effective immediately. I cannot be party to a transaction with such irregularities. This isn't over, Mother said, but the threat sounded hollow even to my ears. Catherine gathered her papers. It is, Mrs. Caldwell. The legal position is unambiguous. The house remains Ellen's property. Any attempts to remove or sell items from the estate need to cease immediately. And the loans? Father asked quietly, his first direct question of the meeting. We can discuss repayment terms, I said, meeting his gaze. I'm not unreasonable. Mother stood abruptly, gathering her purse with trembling hands. 45 years, she said, voice tight with emotion. 45 years I've tried to make you practical, to help you understand how the world really works. And you still choose his way, impractical, sentimental, living in the past. I rose to meet her, feeling strangely calm. It's not about choosing sides, Mother. It's about honoring promises. About respecting what matters, even when it can't be measured in dollars. Something flickered across her face, recognition, perhaps, or the ghost of respect. You're more like him than I thought, she said finally. It wasn't quite an insult, nor was it a compliment. Yes, I agreed simply. I am. She turned and walked away, heels clicking against the hardwood floor. Pamela followed quickly, already on her phone, no doubt spinning the narrative for her social media followers. Father hesitated, conflict evident in every line of his face. Ellen, he began, then stopped, words failing him as they so often did when caught between his wife's demands and his own conscience. It's okay, Dad, I said, and meant it. We'll figure it out. He nodded once, squeezed my shoulder with an unfamiliar firmness, and followed my mother. Catherine and James exchanged business cards, agreeing to coordinate on the formal withdrawal of the sale contract. As they discussed technicalities, I sat back in my chair, a curious lightness spreading through me despite the confrontation's intensity. For 45 years, I'd been the quiet one, the peacekeeper, the one who stepped aside. Today, I'd finally found my voice, not in shouting, but in standing firm for what mattered. Grandpa would have been proud. The inheritance. 1 month later, I stood in Grandpa's study, my study now, surrounded by open boxes and piles of books waiting to be returned to their rightful places on the shelves. Autumn had deepened outside, the maple tree in the garden now a blaze of crimson against a steel blue sky. The house felt different, lighter somehow, as if a heaviness had been lifted from its bones. I'd spent weekends sorting, cleaning, cataloging, discovering small treasures Grandpa had tucked away in unexpected places. A dried flower pressed between the pages of a first edition Thoreau. A handwritten note from Eleanor Roosevelt thanking him for his historical insights. A photograph of him as a young professor, arm around a laughing young woman who would become my grandmother. I was arranging his collection of antique fountain pens when a knock at the front door interrupted my thoughts. Through the window, I spotted my father's car in the driveway, alone, without mother's sleek sedan beside it. He stood awkwardly on the porch, hands tucked into the pockets of his cardigan, looking older and somehow smaller than I remembered. "Ellen," he said when I opened the door. "I hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all." I stepped aside to let him in, noticing the way his eyes moved appreciatively over the half-restored entryway. "I'm just organizing." He nodded, following me into the kitchen where afternoon sunlight warmed the worn wooden table, the same table where Grandpa and I had shared countless cups of tea and conversations. "Coffee?" I offered, and he accepted with a grateful nod. As I prepared 2 mugs, the silence between us felt different from our usual awkward pauses, less strained, more contemplative. "The house looks good," he said finally, accepting the steaming mug I placed before him. "You've been working hard." "It feels right," I replied, settling across from him. "Like bringing things back to their proper places." He nodded, wrapping gnarled fingers around his mug. "Arthritis," I noticed, worse than I'd realized. "Your mother won't be joining me for these visits," he said quietly. She needs time." "I understand." And strangely, I did. Mother's pride had been wounded, her authority challenged, her narrative disrupted. For someone who had spent a lifetime constructing a perfect facade, such cracks in the foundation were devastating. "But I wanted you to know." He hesitated, searching for words that had never come easily to him. "I'm proud of you, Ellen. Standing up for yourself, for Henry's wishes." It couldn't have been easy. The simple acknowledgement brought unexpected tears to my eyes. "It wasn't," I admitted. "But it was necessary." We sipped our coffee in companionable silence for a moment. Then Father reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet pouch. "I found this in my desk drawer," he said, sliding it across the table. "It belongs here with you." Inside the pouch was a tarnished silver pocket watch, its case engraved with intricate leaf patterns. I recognized it immediately, Grandpa's father's watch, part of the Mitchell family heritage. "Mom knows you have this?" I asked, turning the precious object in my palm. A slight smile crossed his face, revealing a hint of the younger man who had once defied his own family to marry Diana Mitchell. "What your mother doesn't know won't hurt her. Some things should stay where they belong." It was a small rebellion, but for my conflict-averse father, it felt monumental. "Thank you," I said simply. He nodded, then glanced around the kitchen, eyes settling on the garden visible through the window. "Do you remember how Henry used to grow those massive pumpkins every October? Had some special fertilizer mix he'd never reveal. Banana peels and coffee grounds," I said, smiling at the memory. He swore me to secrecy. Father chuckled, the sound rusty, but genuine. "Always had his little mysteries, didn't he?" We spent the next hour sharing stories about Grandpa. Some I knew, others new to me, glimpses of the young professor my father had first met when courting my mother, the passionate historian who could lose himself for days in research. As afternoon light lengthened into evening shadows, Father finally rose to leave. At the door, he paused, looking back at the house with a complicated expression. "He always saw something special in you," he said. "Something the rest of us missed." The words warmed me like a physical touch. "I'm trying to be worthy of that. You already are." He squeezed my hand once, then walked to his car with slightly straighter shoulders than when he'd arrived. I watched until his taillights disappeared around the corner, then returned to the study, to the books waiting to be shelved, to the stories waiting to be preserved. Months ago, Grandpa had called me the keeper of meaning. I hadn't fully understood then, but I was beginning to now. It wasn't just about maintaining a collection or preserving a house. It was about honoring the truth behind objects, the human connections they represented, the continuity they provided in a world obsessed with disposability and immediate gratification. I picked up an old leather-bound volume of Emerson's essays, Grandpa's favorite, the pages well-thumbed, margins filled with his neat handwriting. Tucked inside was a bookmark with a quote he'd written out. What lies behind us and what lies before us are tiny matters compared to what lies within us. Outside, the maple leaves rustled in the evening breeze, whispering secrets across generations. Inside, in this house of memory and meaning, I finally understood my inheritance, not just the physical structure with its good bones, but the quiet strength that had always lived within me, waiting to be claimed. Some legacies couldn't be forged, sold, or stolen. Some truths, once recognized, became their own kind of home.